The first thing to break was the silence, not a gunshot, not a scream, but the sharp crack of glass shattering against the dirt. Riven Holt didn't need to look to know it was the signal. He'd been waiting for it since dawn, pacing the length of the old telegraph office like a caged wolf. Outside, the air was heavy with the scent of iron and dust, the kind that clung to your skin and made every breath taste like the land itself. The shattering glass meant one thing: the marauders of Ash Vale had crossed the river. They weren't here for gold, or cattle, or even revenge. They were here for the map, a single sheet of oilskin inked with routes through the canyon nobody else dared to ride. That map was worth more than silver, more than land. It was freedom for whoever held it, and ruin for whoever lost it. Riven had stolen it 2 nights ago, not for himself, but for the woman hiding in the cellar beneath the telegraph floorboards, Liora Vance, a cartographer who'd drawn the map and been hunted ever since. The first rider appeared at the far end of the street, framed by the molten smear of sunset. Then another, and another. 6 in total, their dusters the color of scorched earth, their faces hidden behind masks stitched with black thread. At their head rode Garrick Vey, a man whose name was spoken in the territory like a curse. His eyes were the pale green of old copper, and they fixed on Riven with the cold precision of a marksman lining up a shot. "Riven Holt," Garrick called, voice carrying over the wind. "You've got something that belongs to me." Riven stepped into the street, boots grinding into the grit. His revolver hung at his side, but his voice was steady. "It's not yours. It never was." Garrick's smile was thin, humorless. "You think you can keep it? You think you can keep her?" The riders fanned out, dismounting in a slow, deliberate arc. The sound of metal, revolvers sliding free, rifles cocking, cut through the wind like a blade. The first shot came from Garrick. Riven dropped low, the bullet slicing past his shoulder. His own revolver came up in a smooth arc, the trigger breaking under his finger. The first marauder fell, his rifle clattering to the ground. Chaos erupted. Dust exploded under pounding boots. Muzzle flashes lit the street in bursts of orange and white. Riven moved with precision, each step calculated, each shot placed where it would matter most. He wasn't faster. He was smarter, using the wind to mask his movement, the wagon shadows to break their line of sight. A bullet grazed his arm, hot pain slicing through muscle. He gritted his teeth, reloaded behind the water trough, then came up firing. Another man dropped. Clutching his chest, Garrick advanced through the chaos, revolver steady. Eyes locked on Riven. They were close now, too close. "You should have stayed out of this," Garrick said. Riven's voice was low, almost calm. "You should have stayed out of her life." They fired at the same time. Garrick's shot went wide. Riven's hit center mass. The impact drove Garrick back a step, his revolver slipping from his hand before he crumpled into the dust. The remaining marauders hesitated, then turned and fled into the darkening horizon. Swallowed by the storm, Riven stood alone in the settling dust, chest heaving, revolver still warm in his grip. The wind eased, carrying the faint scent of rain. From the telegraph office, Liora emerged, dirt-streaked, eyes wide. You stopped them," she said. Riven holstered his weapon, crouched to meet her gaze. "No," he said softly. "We survived. That's different." He glanced toward the horizon, knowing Garrick's men would regroup. But tonight, she was safe. Tonight, Riven Holt had stood his ground, and won. The rain never came. The scent of it lingered in the wind, teasing the town with the promise of relief. But the clouds broke apart before they reached Ash Vale. By dawn, the streets were dry again, the dust settling into the cracks like it had never been disturbed. Riven Holt stood at the edge of the freight yard, watching the horizon. He knew Garrick Vey wasn't dead, not yet. The shot he'd put into the marauder leader had been clean, but not fatal. Men like Garrick didn't die easy, and they didn't forgive. Liora Vance emerged from the telegraph office, her hair pulled back, her hands clutching the oilskin map like it was the last piece of herself she could protect. "They'll come again," she said. Riven didn't look at her. "Not here. Not in daylight." She stepped closer, her voice low. "Then where?" He turned to face her, eyes narrowing. "The canyon. They'll try to cut us off before we reach the rail spur. That map's worth more than silver to them. It's the only way through the glass spine without losing half your men to the cliffs. The glass spine wasn't a name given lightly. It was a stretch of canyon where the rock walls rose like jagged blades, catching the sun in shards that could blind a rider at the wrong moment. The ground was a maze of narrow passes, sudden drops, and stone that shattered under hoof. By mid-morning, they were riding hard, Riven in the lead, Liora close behind. The canyon mouth loomed ahead, its shadow swallowing the trail. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a hawk, a black-feathered shape circling high above. Its cry sharp against the silence. Riven's gut tightened. The marauders used hawks to signal. They entered the canyon at a gallop, the walls closing in on either side. The air grew cooler, the light fractured into shards that danced across the stone. Every sound echoed, the clink of tack, the creak of leather, the steady rhythm of hooves. Half a mile in, the ambush came, a rifle cracked from the ridge, the shot sparking off the stone near Riven's head. Another followed, and another, the echoes turning the canyon into a storm of noise. Riven wheeled his horse into a narrow cut, pulling Liora with him. Off the trail, he barked. They dismounted, pressing against the rock as dust rained down from the impacts above. Riven's eyes scanned the ridges, 3 figures, moving fast, rifles flashing in the fractured light. He fired once, the shot catching one marauder in the shoulder. The man staggered, dropped his rifle, and vanished behind the ridge. Liora's breath was ragged. "We can't outrun them here." Riven's voice was calm, but his eyes were sharp. "We're not outrunning them. We're turning the canyon against them." He led her deeper into the cut, where the walls narrowed to a slit barely wide enough for a man to pass. The ground was littered with shards of stone, each one sharp enough to slice leather. From above, Garrick's voice echoed down. "You can't hide forever, Holt." Riven didn't answer. He crouched, scanning the walls, then pointed to a section where the rock was fractured, held together by nothing but pressure and time. "Stay low," he told Liora. He fired into the fracture. The sound was deafening, the impact sending a tremor through the wall. A heartbeat later, the stone gave way, collapsing in a cascade of jagged shards. The marauder on the ridge screamed as the rock slide tore through his position, sending him tumbling into the canyon floor. The others hesitated, and that was all Riven needed. He stepped into the open, revolver steady, and fired twice. One man dropped, the other fled, scrambling up the ridge like a rat escaping floodwater. Silence returned, broken only by the settling of stone. Liora stared at him, eyes wide. "You planned that?" Riven holstered his weapon. "No, I just knew the canyon better than they did." They remounted, pushing deeper into the glass spine. The light shifted, the walls rising higher, the air growing colder. Riven knew Garrick wasn't finished, but every mile they put between themselves. And Ash Vale was another mile Garrick had to cross in hostile ground. And in the glass spine, the land didn't forgive mistakes. The canyon narrowed until the walls were close enough for Riven to touch with both hands. The horse's hooves struck sparks from the stone, each sound swallowed by the vast silence ahead. The air was colder now, heavy with the mineral tang of wet rock, though no rain had fallen. Liora rode behind him, her eyes darting to every shadow. She clutched the oilskin map against her chest as if it could shield her from bullets. "They're still following," she said. Riven didn't answer. He'd heard them long before she spoke, the faint echo of hooves, the occasional clink of metal. Garrick Vale was out there, wounded but relentless, and the glass spine was his hunting ground now as much as theirs. They reached a fork in the canyon. One path sloped upward toward a sunlit ridge. The other plunged into darkness, the walls jagged and wet. Riven chose the dark. The light vanished almost instantly. The horses slowed, their breathing loud in the confined space. Water dripped from unseen cracks, pattering onto stone. Then came the voice. "You're running out of canyon, Holt." It was Garrick, close enough that the words didn't echo. Riven swung down from his saddle, motioning for Liora to stay put. He stepped forward, revolver loose in his grip, eyes scanning the gloom. Garrick emerged from the shadows, his coat torn, blood darkening the fabric at his side. His revolver was steady, his pale green eyes colder than the stone around them. "You could have walked away," Garrick said. "You could have left the girl, left the map, and lived." Riven's voice was low. "And you could have left the territory alone." But here we are. They circled each other slowly, boots scraping on stone. The canyon was so narrow that there was no room for cover. Only the jagged walls and the drop behind Garrick, where the ground fell away into a chasm. Garrick's smile was thin. "You think you can kill me before I kill you?" Riven didn't smile back. "I don't think. I know." The shots came almost together. Garrick's bullet grazed Riven's shoulder. Riven's hit Garrick in the chest, driving him back a step. Garrick staggered, tried to raise his revolver again, and Riven fired once more. The second shot took Garrick off his feet. He stumbled, boots skidding on loose stone. And then he was gone, falling into the chasm, his coat flaring like a broken wing before the darkness swallowed him. Silence returned, heavy and absolute. Riven lowered his revolver, breathing hard. He turned back to Liora, who was staring at him with wide, unblinking eyes. "It's over," he said. She shook her head. "Not for them. Not for the rest of the circle." Riven glanced toward the chasm, then back at her. "Then we'll be ready." They mounted up and rode on, the canyon opening ahead into a sweep of pale stone and distant sky. The glass spine had taken Garrick Vey, but it hadn't broken Riven Holt. And somewhere beyond the horizon, the rest of the marauders would hear what happened here and know that the man who carried the map was still alive. The settlement appeared like a mirage at the edge of the prairie. Low buildings of timber and stone, their roofs silvered by years of wind and sun. A single water tower stood watch over the place, its shadow stretching long across the dirt street. Riven Holt and Liora Vance rode in at dusk, the sky painted in streaks of amber and deep indigo. The horses were exhausted, their flanks dark with sweat, but they kept moving. Behind them, the glass spine lay silent. For now, Ironwood Crossing wasn't much, but it had walls. Not tall ones, not strong enough to stop a determined army, but enough to slow one down. And for Riven, slowing the enemy was the first step to beating them. They dismounted outside the saloon, where the sign creaked in the wind. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of tobacco and the low murmur of voices. Every head turned when they entered. A man at the bar, broad-shouldered, with hair gone to silver, set down his glass and studied Riven. "You're not from here," he said. Riven met his gaze. Passing through, looking for supplies, the man's eyes flicked to Liora, then to the oilskin map she carried. "That's not something you carry in plain sight unless you want trouble." Riven's jaw tightened. "Trouble's already looking for us." The man introduced himself as Elias Ward, foreman of the rail spur that cut through Ironwood. He'd heard of the marauders of Ash Vale and of Garrick Vey. "They won't stop," Elias said. "Not until they've got what they came for. And if they think you're here, they'll come here." Riven nodded. "Then we make sure they regret it." By nightfall, the plan was taking shape. Elias could muster a dozen men, ranchers, rail workers, a few with rifles that hadn't seen use in years. Riven walked the perimeter, noting weak points in the walls, places where the dust could hide movement. Liora worked with Elias's daughter, Mara, to copy sections of the map onto smaller sheets. If the marauders breached the walls, the original would be hidden, buried in a place only Riven and Liora knew. The air grew colder as the night deepened. Somewhere beyond the prairie, a coyote called, its cry sharp against the silence. Riven stood at the north gate, eyes on the horizon. He didn't know when the marauders would come, but he knew they would. And when they did, Ironwood Crossing would be ready. The first sign wasn't the sound of hooves. It was the sudden stillness of the prairie. Riven Holt stood at the north gate, watching the horizon as the wind died. The grass stopped moving, the air thickened, and the faint hum of insects faded into silence. It was the kind of quiet that meant something was coming. Something big. Elias Ward joined him, rifle in hand. "They're out there," he said. Riven nodded. "They're waiting for the light to drop." By the time the sun touched the rim of the prairie, the first riders appeared, dark shapes against the molten sky. They didn't charge. They spread out, forming a wide arc around Ironwood Crossing, their dusters snapping in the wind. Liora Vance stood on the saloon balcony, scanning the line with a borrowed spyglass. "At least 20, she called down. "Maybe more." Riven's jaw tightened. Garrick Vey was gone, but the marauders of Ash Vale had come in force. And tonight, they weren't here to scare anyone. They were here to take the map. The first volley came from the east, rifle fire cracking through the dusk, bullets sparking off the wall. Men scrambled to return fire, the sound of gunshots echoing through the narrow streets. Riven moved fast, directing Elias's men to cover the weak points. Keep them off the south wall. They'll try to breach there. The marauders shifted tactics quickly. A group of 5 dismounted and advanced on foot, using the low scrub for cover. Riven spotted them and fired, dropping one before they reached the wall. The others scattered, returning fire in short, sharp bursts from the west. A sudden roar. The marauders had brought a wagon, its bed piled with burning brush. They drove it toward the wall, the flames licking higher as the wheels rattled over the dirt. "Stop that wagon!" Riven shouted. To riflemen on the wall fired, hitting the driver. The wagon veered, crashing into a ditch before it could reach the gate. The flames sputtered, sending black smoke curling into the sky, but the distraction had worked. From the north, another group of marauders rushed the gate, their boots pounding the dirt. Riven met them head-on, revolver blazing. He dropped 2 before they reached the gate, then slammed the heavy bar into place as the survivors pounded against it. Inside the walls, chaos reigned. A bullet shattered a window, sending glass raining onto the street. A horse screamed, rearing as its rider tried to calm it. Liora appeared at Riven's side, her face pale but determined. "They're trying to flank us through the old rail cut," she said. Riven's eyes narrowed. The rail cut was a narrow trench that led straight into the heart of Ironwood. If the marauders got through, the fight would be over in minutes. "Take Elias and 3 men." Riven told her. "Hold that cut. Don't let them through." She hesitated. "What about you?" "I'll keep the rest busy." She nodded and ran, her boots pounding the dirt. The night deepened, the sky turning black above the flicker of gunfire. The air was thick with smoke and the sharp tang of spent powder. Riven moved from wall to wall, firing, reloading, shouting orders. From the east, a sudden scream. One of Elias's men went down, clutching his leg. Riven fired into the shadows, driving the attackers back. Then came the sound he'd been waiting for, the deep, rolling thunder of hooves. The marauders had committed their cavalry. They charged from the south, a wall of dust and steel. The ground shook under the impact, the riders firing as they came. Riven grabbed a rifle from a fallen man and took aim, dropping the lead rider. The charge faltered, the horses skidding as their riders tried to regroup. From the rail cut, Liora's voice rang out, sharp, commanding. "Hold the line." Riven risked a glance and saw her standing in the trench, revolver in one hand, knife in the other. Elias was beside her, firing into the dark. The marauders pressed hard, but the narrow walls of the cut worked against them, forcing them into single file. Riven turned back to the south wall, firing until the rifle clicked empty. He dropped it, drew his revolver, and stepped into the open. The marauders hesitated, just long enough for the men on the wall to unleash a volley. That sent them scattering. The fight dragged on for what felt like hours. The air was a haze of smoke, the ground littered with spent shells and the bodies of men who'd thought they could take Ironwood Crossing. When the last shot faded, the silence returned, heavy, absolute. Riven stood at the gate, chest heaving, revolver still warm in his grip. Liora emerged from the rail cut, her hair loose, her face streaked with dirt. Elias followed, limping but alive. "They're gone," she said. Riven nodded. "For now." He looked around at the battered walls, the wounded men, the smoke curling into the night sky. Ironwood Crossing had held, barely, but he knew the marauders would come again. And next time, they'd bring more than rifles and fire. The decision was made before dawn. Ironwood Crossing still smelled of smoke from the siege, the streets littered with spent shells and broken boards. Men limped through the dust, repairing walls that would never be strong enough for the next attack. Riven Holt stood at the north gate, staring toward the prairie. Liora joined him, the oilskin map tucked under her arm. "They'll come again," she said. Riven shook his head. "No, we're going to them." Elias Ward tried to argue, but Riven's mind was set. The marauders of Ash Vale had lost Garrick Vey, but their numbers were growing. Every day they stayed hidden. They gathered more rifles, more horses, more men willing to kill, for a share of the canyon roots. If Riven and Liora could take the fight to their stronghold, a cluster of stone buildings. Built into the cliffs above the vale, they could end it before the next siege began. By mid-morning, they were riding hard, the prairie stretching wide and empty under a pale sky. The wind carried the scent of sage and the faint tang of iron from the distant cliffs. The journey was dangerous. The Ash Vale territory was a maze of gullies and ridges, each one a perfect place for an ambush. Twice they spotted riders shadowing them from a distance, but neither group closed in. Riven knew they were being watched, measured, tested. By the second day, the land began to change. The grass thinned, replaced by jagged stone and patches of dry scrub. The cliffs rose ahead, their faces streaked with red and black, like old scars. They camped in a narrow ravine, the fire small and smokeless. Liora studied the map by lamplight, tracing the route with her finger. "There's a pass here," she said, pointing to a thin line between the ridges. "It's the fastest way in, but it's exposed." Riven nodded. "We'll take it. If they see us coming, they'll think we're walking into a trap. That's when we turn it on them." The next morning, they reached the pass. The walls rose high on either side, the stone sharp enough to cut skin. The wind funneled through, carrying the sound of distant hoof beats. Halfway through, the trap was sprung. Rifle fire cracked from the ridges, bullets sparking off stone. Riven wheeled his horse into a shallow cut, pulling Liora with him. "Keep moving," he shouted. They pushed forward, firing into the shadows above. One marauder fell, his rifle clattering down the slope. The others shifted position, trying to block the exit. Riven spotted a narrow ledge halfway up the wall. "Up there," he called. They scrambled up, boots slipping on loose rock. From the ledge, Riven had a clear view of the ridge and the men firing down at them. He took aim, dropping two in quick succession. The rest broke, retreating toward the stronghold. By midday, they reached the vale. The stronghold was carved into the cliff face, its stone walls blending with the rock. Smoke curled from chimneys, and the sound of hammering echoed through the canyon. Riven studied it from a distance. "They've fortified since Garrick died," he said. Liora's eyes narrowed. "Then we make them think we're more than two." They waited until dusk, then lit 3 separate fires along the ridge, each one placed to look like a camp. From the stronghold, it would seem an army had arrived. The marauders reacted fast. Riders poured out of the gates, splitting into groups to scout the camps. Riven and Liora moved in the opposite direction, slipping down a narrow trail toward the main gate. Inside, the stronghold was a maze of stone corridors and open yards. Riven moved like a shadow, revolver ready, every step calculated. They found the war room quickly, a long table covered in maps, rifles stacked against the wall. Liora grabbed the maps, stuffing them into her satchel. Riven poured lamp oil over the rifles, then lit a match. The flames caught fast, the heat driving them back into the yard. Shouts erupted. The marauders were returning, their boots pounding the stone. Riven fired twice, dropping the first man through the gate. Liora ducked behind a wall, reloading. They fought their way out, the stronghold burning behind them. By the time they reached the ridge, the vale was lit with orange fire, the smoke curling into the night sky. Riven didn't look back. "They'll rebuild," he said, "but not before the territory knows they bled tonight." Liora's voice was steady. "And they'll know who made them bleed." The fire at Ash Vale burned for 2 days. By the time the smoke thinned, the stronghold was nothing but blackened stone and twisted iron. Word spread fast, faster than Riven, Holt, and Liora Vance could ride in the saloons of Drywater, in the rail yards of Copper Bend, in the ranch houses scattered across the prairie. People whispered the same thing. The marauders bled. The Vale fell. Some called it justice. Others called it a mistake. Riven and Liora kept moving, avoiding towns where the talk was loudest. They knew the marauders weren't gone, only scattered. And scattered enemies could be worse than united ones. 3 days after leaving the Vale, they reached a ridge overlooking the lowlands. The land below was dotted with camps, not marauder camps, but something else. Liora studied them through the spyglass. "Not Ash Vale colors," she said. "Different banners, different horses." Riven's jaw tightened. "Opportunists. The kind who move in when the old wolves are wounded." The camps belonged to the Hollow Spur Company. a mercenary outfit that had been sniffing around the territory for months. They weren't loyal to anyone. They fought for whoever paid them, and right now, the marauders had coin to spend. That night, they camped in a dry wash, the fire small and hidden. Liora spread the salvaged maps across a blanket, tracing routes with her finger. If the hollow spur joins what's left of the marauders, they'll have enough men to take Ironwood and the glass spine. Riven didn't answer immediately. He was staring into the dark, listening to the wind. They'll move fast, he said finally. Faster than we can warn Ironwood. Liora's eyes met his. Then we don't warn them. We stop them before they start. The next day, they rode hard toward the hollow spur's largest camp. The land was open, the sky a hard blue, the air sharp with the scent of dry grass. By midday, they were close enough to see the camp clearly, rows of tents, a corral full of restless horses, and a central fire where men sat cleaning rifles. Riven studied the layout. Too many to take head-on, he said. We cut the legs out from under them. They waited until nightfall. The camp was quiet, the men asleep or drunk. Riven moved like a shadow, slipping between tents, his boots silent on the packed earth. Liora followed, her satchel heavy with lamp oil. They worked fast, dousing the corral fence, the supply wagons, the ammunition crates. When the oil was spent, Riven lit a single match. The fire caught instantly, racing along the fence, leaping to the wagons. Horses screamed, breaking through the weakened rails. Men stumbled from their tents, shouting, firing blindly into the dark. Riven and Liora were already gone, riding hard into the night. Behind them, the hollow spur camp was chaos, flames, smoke, and the sound of men trying to save what couldn't be saved. By dawn, they were miles away, the horizon wide and empty. Liora looked back once, then tucked the map under her arm. That's to strongholds gone, she said. Riven's voice was steady. And more coming. The prairie was restless, the wind carrying more than dust. It carried the scent of war. From the ridge above Copper Bend, Riven Holt could see 3 separate columns of riders moving across the land, each one raising its own trail of ochre dust. The marauders of Ash Vale, fractured but still dangerous, were regrouping after the fall of their stronghold. The hollow spur mercenaries, humiliated by the destruction of their camp, were riding hard to reclaim their reputation. And from the north came the Red Fen Riders, marshland raiders, whose loyalty was to spoils alone. Ironwood Crossing was the prize, and whoever claimed it would control the glass spine routes, the rail spur, and the lifeblood of trade across half the territory. Liora Vance stood beside Riven, the oilskin map tucked under her arm, her eyes scanning the horizon. They'll join forces, she said quietly. They won't waste time fighting each other first. Riven's jaw tightened. Then we make sure they never get the chance. They rode back to Ironwood before nightfall. Elias Ward met them at the gate, his face shadowed by worry. Riven told him what they'd seen, and Elias didn't bother to hide his fear. We can't hold against that many, he said. Riven didn't argue. We're not going to hold. We're going to hit them before they hit us. Word spread fast. By the next day, riders from Drywater, Copper Bend, and the ranchlands began arriving. Not soldiers, but men and women with rifles, grit, and something to lose. The streets filled with the smell of horses and gun oil, the low murmur of planning. Liora worked with Mara Ward to copy sections of the map, marking choke points, water sources, and places where the land could be turned against the enemy. At dawn, Riven led 20 riders to intercept the hollow spur mercenaries at Blackwind Ford, a narrow crossing where the river ran fast and deep. Mist curled over the water, hiding the trap they'd set. As the mercenaries entered the ford, Riven's men cut the upstream dam. A surge of cold water roared through the crossing, sweeping horses off their feet, scattering men into the current. Shouts turned to screams, rifles were lost to the river, and by the time the survivors crawled to the bank, they were in no shape to march on Ironwood. While Riven fought at the ford, Liora took a smaller force north to meet the Red Fen Riders in the ridges. She knew they relied on speed and intimidation, so she gave them neither. Fires set in the dry scrub sent thick smoke into the passes, choking the air and spooking their mounts. Hidden sharpshooters picked them off one by one, the echoes of gunfire bouncing between the stone walls. By the time the smoke cleared, the riders had turned back toward the marshlands, leaving only the marauders still moving toward Ironwood. The marauders came at dusk, their numbers smaller than before but still dangerous. They rode hard, dusters snapping in the wind, rifles flashing in the fading light. Riven met them in the open prairie, far from the town's walls, choosing ground where the land itself could be a weapon. The clash was immediate, a storm of dust, muzzle flashes, and the deafening crack of gunfire. Riven fought with precision, every shot placed, every move calculated. Liora was at his side, her revolver steady, her eyes sharp, calling out positions and spotting flanking riders before they could close in. The marauders tried to swing wide, but Riven's riders cut them off, forcing them into a narrow gully where the high walls trapped them like cattle in a pen. The fight turned brutal in the confined space, the air thick with powder smoke and the smell of sweat and blood. By nightfall, the marauders broke, scattering into the dark, leaving the prairie littered with the wounded and the dead. When the last echo of gunfire faded, Ironwood Crossing stood untouched. The fighters returned to the town in silence, their faces marked by exhaustion and the knowledge that they had done more than defend a wall. They had changed the balance of power in the territory. Elias Ward found Riven at the gate, his voice low but certain. "You've done more than hold the town. You've made them think twice." Riven didn't answer. He was staring at the horizon, where the dust had finally settled, knowing it was only a matter of time before another storm rose. Liora stepped beside him, her voice steady. "It's not over." Riven's reply was quiet, almost to himself. "No, but now they know we're not waiting for them anymore." Ironwood Crossing had survived the storm, but the air inside its walls was heavy with suspicion. The streets still smelled of gunpowder. The boards of the north gate were splintered from rifle fire, and the people moved with the slow, deliberate caution of those who knew peace was only borrowed time. Riven Holt kept watch from the gate while Liora Vance worked in the saloon's back room, spreading the salvaged maps across a table and marking new routes. They both knew the marauders would regroup eventually, but neither expected the next threat to come from within. Elias Ward found Riven just after midnight, his face pale in the lantern light. "Half the ammunition we stored in the depot is gone," he said, voice low. Riven's eyes narrowed. "Who had the keys?" Elias hesitated. "Only me, and 2 others I trust." Riven didn't like the way he said it. Trust was a fragile thing in a town that had just fought for its life. He followed Elias to the depot, where the lock hung broken and the shelves were stripped bare. The floor was littered with boot prints, too many to belong to one man. Some prints were fresh, others smudged, as if someone had tried to cover their tracks by dawn. Whispers had spread through Ironwood. Some said the Hollow Spur mercenaries had bribed a local. Others claimed the marauders had a man inside the walls. Riven kept his thoughts to himself, but his gut told him the truth was worse. Someone here was playing both sides. Liora joined him at the depot, her eyes scanning the prints. "These aren't from the same boots," she said. 2, maybe 3 people, and they knew exactly what they were taking. She picked up a spent cartridge from the floor, turning it in her fingers. "They left this on purpose. It's a message." That night, Riven walked the streets alone, listening. In the quiet, he caught fragments of conversation. A name here, a promise there. He followed the trail to the old freight office, where the door was ajar and the smell of tobacco hung in the air. Inside, 3 men sat around a table, their voices low. One of them was a guard from the north wall. Another was a rancher who'd ridden in after the siege. The third was a stranger Riven didn't recognize. On the table between them lay a pouch heavy with coins and a folded scrap of paper. Riven stepped into the doorway, revolver in hand. "You boys planning another siege?" he asked. The guard froze, the rancher swore under his breath, and the stranger reached for the paper. Riven crossed the room into strides, snatching it before the man could move. It was a crude map of Ironwood, marked with entry points and supply caches. "You've been selling the town," Riven said, his voice cold. The stranger smirked. "Not selling, trading. You think you can hold this place forever? Better to pick the winning side." Riven's reply was a single, sharp motion, the butt of his revolver catching the man across the jaw. He hit the floor hard, coins scattering by morning. The three were locked in the cellar beneath the saloon, guarded by men Elias trusted. But the damage was done. The enemy now knew Ironwood's weak points, and the town's unity had been cracked from the inside. Liora stood beside Riven at the gate, her voice tight. "If they come now, we'll be fighting our own shadows." Riven looked out at the horizon, where the dust was already rising again. "Then we make sure those shadows don't live long enough to see the gate." The attack came before dawn. Riven Holt had barely closed his eyes when the first shot cracked through the stillness, splintering the north gate's upper beam. He was on his feet instantly, revolver in hand, boots pounding the dirt as shouts erupted across Ironwood Crossing. This wasn't the chaotic rush of a siege. It was precise, targeted, and fast. Whoever was outside knew exactly where to hit. The traitor's map had done its work. From the east wall, rifle fire poured in, not at random, but at the weak points Riven had marked weeks ago for repair. The enemy, a mix of marauder veterans and hollow spur mercenaries, moved like a single unit, their dusters snapping in the wind as they advanced in staggered lines. Liora Vance was already on the saloon balcony, her revolver barking into the half-light. "They're splitting," she called down. "Two groups, one for the depot, one for the rail cut." Riven swore under his breath. The depot held what little ammunition Ironwood had left. The rail cut was the fastest way into the center of town. If either fell, the fight would be over in minutes. He sprinted toward the depot, Elias Ward at his side. Bullets sparked off the wall as they ducked behind the water trough. Riven fired twice, dropping a man who'd been trying to force the door. Elias kicked the body aside and slammed the bar into place. "They'll try again," Elias said, breathing hard. "They won't get the chance," Riven replied. From the rail cut, the sound of hooves and shouting rose. The second group had breached the outer trench. Liora was holding them back with a handful of fighters, but the narrow pass was filling with smoke from burning brush the enemy had set alight. Riven made a choice. "Hold the depot," he told Elias. "If it falls, we're done." Then he ran, cutting through the side streets toward the rail cut. The smoke was thick, stinging his eyes, but he could see Leora's silhouette through the haze, revolver in one hand, knife in the other, her stance steady despite the chaos. Three riders pushed toward her, their horses skidding on the loose gravel. Riven fired from the flank, hitting the lead rider square in the chest. The others wheeled away, but Liora was already moving, driving her knife into the arm of one before kicking him from the saddle. The enemy regrouped fast. More men poured into the cut, rifles raised. Riven grabbed Leora's arm. "Fall back to the ridge." They scrambled up the slope, boots slipping on the loose stone. From the ridge, Riven could see the entire fight, the depot holding under Elias's defense, the rail cut choked with smoke and bodies, and beyond the walls, the enemy's main force waiting for the signal to push in. He didn't wait for them to make the call. Riven pulled the small pouch of dynamite from his belt, the last of Ironwood's reserves, and lit the fuse. "Cover me," he told Liora. She fired into the cut as he hurled the charge down into the narrow pass. The explosion tore through the smoke, sending stone and dust into the air. Men screamed, horses bolted, and the pass was blocked by a wall of debris. The sudden shift broke the enemy's rhythm. Without the rail cut, they had to regroup, and in that moment, Ironwood's fighters surged from the walls, rifles blazing. The marauders faltered. The hollow spur mercenaries pulled back, and within minutes, the field outside the town was empty except for the wounded and the dead. Riven stood on the ridge, chest heaving, revolver still warm in his grip. Liora joined him, her face streaked with soot. "They'll try again," she said. Riven nodded. "And next time, they won't have a map." The dust from the morning's battle hadn't even settled when Riven Holt swung into the saddle. The traitors locked in the saloon cellar were gone, the guards overpowered, the door splintered, the coins and crude map taken with them. Elias Ward's voice was tight with fury as he told Riven what happened. They had help from outside, horses waiting beyond the south ridge. Riven didn't waste time asking how. He knew the longer they stayed in Ironwood, the colder the trail would get. Liora Vance was already mounted, the oilskin map strapped to her saddlebag. "They'll ride for the marauders," she said. "Straight into the glass spine if they think it'll shake us." Riven's eyes narrowed. Then we ride faster. They left Ironwood at a gallop, the prairie stretching wide and empty under a hard blue sky. The wind carried the scent of sage and the faint tang of stone from the distant ridges. Tracks were easy to follow at first, deep cuts in the dirt from fresh horses, bootprints where the riders had dismounted to water them. But as the land grew rough, the trail split. One set of tracks veered toward the low scrub. The other climbed into the narrow passes of the spine. Riven chose the passes. The traders knew the marauders would be waiting there, and the spine's jagged walls would make an ambush easy. By midday, the light had shifted, fractured into shards that danced across the stone. Every sound echoed, the creak of leather, the steady rhythm of hooves, the faint clink of metal ahead. They found the first body at the mouth of a cut. One of the traders, his throat opened, his boots gone. Liora crouched beside him, her voice low. They didn't make it far. The marauders are cleaning house. Riven's jaw tightened. Then the last two are still worth something to them. The trail narrowed, forcing them to dismount and lead the horses. Above, shadows moved along the ridge, riders keeping pace, rifles glinting in the sun. Riven didn't look up. "They're watching," he said, "waiting for us to make a mistake." The mistake came from the traders themselves. A shout echoed from deeper in the pass, followed by the sharp crack of a rifle. Riven broke into a run, Liora close behind. They rounded a bend to find the last two traders pinned against the wall, marauders closing in from both sides. One of the men, the stranger from the freight office, saw Riven and shouted, "Help me. I can tell you where they're hiding." Riven didn't slow. His revolver came up, the shot dropping the nearest marauder. Liora fired from the flank, forcing the others back. The traders tried to bolt, but Riven caught the stranger by the collar, dragging him toward the horses. "You're coming with us," he said, voice cold. They rode hard out of the spine. The marauders in pursuit. Bullets sparked off stone, dust choked the air, and the sound of hooves was a constant drumbeat behind them. Riven led them into a narrow wash, where the walls rose high and the ground was littered with loose rock. "Now," he said, and Liora kicked her horse into a sharp turn, sending a cascade of stone down onto the riders behind. The marauders scattered, their pursuit broken dot by nightfall. They were miles from the spine. The trader sat bound against a mesquite tree, his eyes darting between Riven and Liora. "You want the hideout?" he said. "I'll give it to you. Just don't hand me back to them." Riven crouched, his gaze steady. "You'll give us more than that. You'll ride with us, and you'll walk us through their door." The man swallowed hard, knowing there was no bargaining left. Liora glanced at Riven, her voice quiet but certain. "We're taking the fight to them again." Riven nodded, the firelight catching in his eyes. "And this time, we're not leaving anyone alive to come back." The trader's name was Cade Mercer, and he rode between Riven, Holt, and Liora Vance with his hands bound to the saddle horn. The night was cold, the moon a thin blade above the jagged ridges, and every hoofbeat echoed off the stone like a warning. Cade had given them the location, a hollow in the cliffs, where the marauders kept their supplies and planned their raids. But Riven knew a man like Mercer never told the whole truth. They reached the outer edge of the hollow just before dawn. The place was quiet, too quiet, the kind of stillness that meant eyes were already on them. Riven dismounted, checking the revolver at his hip. "You walk in first," he told Mercer. "If they trust you, they'll let you get close." Mercer swallowed hard but nodded. From the ridge above, Liora scanned the hollow. The marauders' camp was built into the cliff face, half hidden by rock and shadow. Crates were stacked near the entrance, rifles leaning against them. A single watchman stood by the gate, his coat snapping in the wind. Mercer walked forward, calling out in a low voice. The watchman turned, recognition flashing in his eyes, and then suspicion. He stepped closer, hand drifting toward his weapon. That was when Riven moved. He came out of the shadows like a storm, revolver barking twice. The watchman dropped, the shots echoing through the hollow. Shouts erupted from inside, boots pounding against stone. Liora was already firing from the ridge, her bullets sparking off crates and driving the marauders into cover. Riven pushed through the gate, using the stacked supplies as shields. Two men rushed him. He dropped one with a shot to the chest, slammed the other into the wall, and took his rifle. Mercer ducked behind a crate, shouting something Riven couldn't hear over the gunfire. The fight turned fast and brutal. The marauders tried to flank, but Liora's position on the ridge gave her a clear line of fire. She picked off anyone who broke cover, her shots precise, her breathing steady despite the chaos. Riven moved deeper into the hollow, kicking over crates of ammunition and spilling their contents into the dirt. A shot rang out from the upper ledge, grazing his shoulder. He spun, firing back, and the shooter toppled into the dust below. Mercer took the chance to run, but Riven was faster. He caught him by the collar, dragging him toward the center of the camp. "You're not leaving until this place is ash," he said. They worked quickly. Liora tossed lamp oil over the supply stacks. Riven lit a match, and the flames caught instantly, racing up the crates and licking at the cliff walls. The heat drove the remaining marauders back toward the far exit, where the narrow path forced them into single file. Riven and Liora cut them down one by one, the smoke curling into the pale morning sky. By the time the fire reached the upper ledges, the hollow was a ruin. Mercer sat in the dirt, coughing, his eyes wide as he watched the camp burn. "You've just made enemies you can't outrun," he said. Riven holstered his revolver, his voice cold. "Then I'll stop running." They left the hollow as the flames consumed the last of the supplies. Behind them, the cliff face glowed with heat, the smoke rising like a signal to the territory. The marauders had lost another stronghold, and the war was far from over. The smoke from the hollow still clung to their clothes when Riven, Holt, and Liora Vance rode back into Ironwood Crossing. The townspeople watched them from doorways and windows, eyes wary, as if they weren't sure whether to cheer or brace for the next fight. Word of the marauders' loss had already spread, but so had something else. Rumors that the territory was now open for the taking. By the second night, riders began arriving from settlements Riven barely knew. Some came with offers of alliance, others with thinly veiled threats. The Red Fen riders had sent a messenger, a weary man with eyes like wet stone, promising mutual protection in exchange for a share of the glass spine roots. The Hollow Spur mercenaries, still licking their wounds, sent word they'd fight alongside Ironwood if given control of the rail spur. Even a group from Copper Bend, traders who'd never fired a rifle in their lives, offered coin for a seat at whatever table was being set. Elias Ward gathered them in the saloon, the air thick with tobacco smoke and tension. Riven stood at the far end of the room, listening as each faction made their pitch. Liora sat beside him, her gaze sharp, reading the faces as much as the words. She leaned close, her voice low. "They're not here to help. They're here to carve the territory into pieces." When the last offer was made, Riven stepped forward. "Ironwood doesn't trade its walls for promises," he said. "If you want to stand with us, you fight with us. No shares, no rail spur, no roots. You bleed here, or you leave." The room went quiet. Some shifted in their seats, others stared at him with open hostility. The Red Fen messenger smiled thinly. "You'll find that standing alone makes you an easy mark." That night, Liora found Riven at the north gate, staring out at the dark prairie. "You just turned down every ally we could have had," she said. Riven didn't look at her. Allies who want the same thing as the enemy aren't allies. They're just waiting for the right moment to take it. She didn't argue, but her silence carried its own weight. 2 days later, the first test came. A caravan from Copper Bend was ambushed on the Glass Spine Trail, not by marauders, but by men wearing Red Fen colors. The survivors staggered into Ironwood with news that the riders had claimed the trail as their own, warning that anyone who used it without paying would be left in the dust. Elias wanted to send a message, but Riven shook his head. "We don't send messages. We send riders." By dawn, Riven and Liora were in the saddle again, heading north. The wind was sharp, carrying the scent of rain, and the land ahead was a mix of open prairie and jagged stone. They rode hard, knowing the riders would expect retaliation, but not so soon. When they reached the trail, they found the riders camped in a narrow pass, their horses tethered, their rifles stacked against a rock wall. Riven didn't wait. He charged straight into the camp, revolver blazing, Liora at his flank. The fight was quick and brutal. The riders scattered, some fleeing into the pass, others dropping where they stood. By the time the smoke cleared, the trail was theirs again. They left the bodies where they fell, a warning to anyone who thought Ironwood's roots were for sale. As they rode back, Liora glanced at Riven, her voice steady. "You know this means the riders will come for us." Riven's reply was calm, almost cold. "Then they'll find out Ironwood doesn't break." The prairie was quiet again, but it was the kind of quiet that carried scars. Ironwood Crossing stood, its walls patched, its streets swept clean of the last battle's dust. The people moved with a steadiness born from survival. Yet every glance toward the horizon carried the same question: when will the next storm come? Riven Holt walked the length of the north wall, the oilskin map now locked in a steel case beneath the saloon floor. Liora Vance joined him, her boots crunching softly on the gravel. They had fought off the marauders, broken the hollow spur mercenaries, and sent the red fen riders back to their marshes. But victory in the territory was never permanent. It was only a pause between fights. Elias Ward met them at the gate, his voice low. "The factions are quiet for now. No riders spotted in 3 days." Riven nodded, but his eyes stayed on the horizon. "Quiet doesn't mean safe. It means they're thinking." Leora's gaze followed his. "And so are we." That night, the town gathered in the saloon. No speeches, no celebration, just the shared silence of people who understood what had been won and what could still be lost. Riven stood at the back, watching faces lit by lamplight, knowing each one had risked something to keep Ironwood standing. Liora leaned against the bar, her eyes meeting his across the room. In that moment, they both knew the fight had changed them, not into heroes, but into survivors who refused to bend. When dawn came, the wind carried no dust, only the scent of sage and the faint promise of rain. Riven saddled his horse, Liora beside him, and together they rode out beyond the walls. They didn't ride to chase an enemy or claim new ground. They rode because the land was theirs to protect, and because the horizon was never truly empty dot as the sun broke over the glass spine. Riven glanced at Liora and spoke the words that would stay with her long after the echoes of gunfire faded in the west. "Peace isn't given, it's taken, and kept by those willing to ride for it."